Let me get this rolling here. Good evening. Hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for attending. See a lot of familiar names, familiar locations here. Feel free to jump in the chat just like Ray did and say hi and say where you're from. We're very happy to have you here tonight. We're going to get started here in just a few seconds. Let everyone filter into the room, and then we will get going. Okay. Great. All right. Hey, Anita, Jacqueline. Ray, I won't try to guess where you are because I know. So, because you just mentioned it. So
Yeah.
I'll let everyone else guess because it's very beautiful. Um, well, while people are filtering in, I want to do a few quick announcements. So first, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Madry, I'm the CEO of ASMP, and of course we love NANPA and are so happy to have Ray here, who's going to be giving an incredible webinar. We're also really happy about our partnership with Hunt's Photo and Video and Gary Farber. And Gary's here as well, and Gary's going to talk a little bit about the Hunt's webinar series that you're watching here and making that possible, and then introduce Ray before we get into the program. Very happy to see everyone. Lots of exciting things getting ready to happen for the summer over at NANPA. You know, we have coming up here in less than a month is Nature Photography Day on June 15th. So definitely stay in the loop for that. Check various emails. We just announced some brand new NANPA photo tours, some of which are really incredible, including a trip to photograph the auroras and Yellowknife up in Canada, which we're very much with Rod Barbie as the instructor. Very much looking forward to that. But tonight is about Ray Hennessy and his incredible work photographing birds. Before we turn to Ray, I'm going to hand it off now to Gary from Hunt's Photo and Video to talk a little bit about tonight's program. All right, Gary.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thomas, for everything you do and all the stuff, great stuff you do for NAMPA. You've been a real key part the last 3 years of NAMPA and turning things around. So kudos to you for everything you do for NAMPA. A little about Hans. I know I do recognize some people, but I've been with Hans now for about 30 years. And really what I've strived on more than anything else is more the personalized service, the personal touch. For me, relations is much more important to me than just making a sale just to make a sale. I really try to be part of the family and part of the community type thing. I do work with a lot of camera clubs and photographers around the country. So if you're ever looking for a program for your photography club, I can put my information down in chat. You can reach out to me, and I'm happy to support your camera clubs around the country and providing speakers for you. Um, as far as hunts goes, some of the things we do, one of the new things we do is we do a lot of education ourselves. So if you're looking to do a trip of hunts or do an education or anything like that, we now do over 200 classes and workshops around the country. So you can go on the Hunts EDU website and see everything that we're doing there. If you're ever looking for a one-on-one class, want to learn about a new lens or a new camera or a new camera you purchase, we also do one-on-one classes as well. So you can reach out to me there and happy to set you up with a team on one-on-one classes. And another thing that we do, we actually do a very good job at it. I think better than the CVS or some of the other places, but we do printing as well. We have some very high quality printing stuff. So if you go on Hunt's Picks, you can see everything we're doing and all the printing service that we do there. But also another thing that I've done for people who know me well, a big thing that I've done in the last 3 years, besides being in the business for a long time, I picked up photography. So I'm doing a lot of wildlife photography, nature stuff. You can see all my work on my Instagram page, my Facebook page. I'm currently shooting with a Sony 7 Mark IV, a Tamron 150 500, and a Tamron 90 macro lens, and I travel around the country. I've been to I've been to Florida. I've been to Alaska. I'm going to Panama in about a week. I've been all over the country shooting. So that's been a really great thing of mine and a thing of mine that I purely love doing. So again, if you guys need anything, reach out to me, give me an opportunity. I'll put my information down in chat, and I promise I won't let you down. So that's a little about me. I got two more seminars that I'm gonna sponsor. You'll get more information about that as well. But anyway, without further ado, I got to know Ray through another photographer named Cameron Donnell. I'm not sure if you ever know of him, but he was a really young rock star, a young photographer that really introduced me to Ray. And I've been very lucky and fortunate to build a great working relationship with Ray. I hope one day to get Ray to the NANPA Summit, and see everybody. And see, I think he'd be a great fit for the summit. But he's become a really great friend of mine, and he's done great work and stuff like that. He has an amazing website and stuff like that. So without further ado, I'll turn this program over to the one and only Ray Hennessy, and you guys are in for a great program and a great treat. So thank you very much, Ray, for coming on and doing this. And we'll leave questions. I don't know, however, Ray, if you want to handle questions, we can do that. But I'll turn this program over to Ray. So thank you so much. I appreciate everything you do and all the support you give me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. Gary's always the best. I totally recommend for anybody interested, definitely reach out to Hunts. I've been working with them for quite some time now. Always great service, and Gary gives me the best introductions every time, so I'm always grateful for that. And then Tom and crew and everybody at NANPA, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. For anybody not familiar with me, I am a full-time wildlife photographer who lives in this van. I'm coming to you from my van right now. My fiance and I live in this, and we're coming to you from the Tetons right now. So that's the Teton Range right back there. We're actually kind of off to that side. But so today I want to talk to everybody about creative bird photography and what that means to me. And my goal with this presentation is to give you a lot of different ideas and things to try to really push your photography. So as far as questions go, I have a few breakpoints along the way, but I do have the Q&A open and the chat open, so feel free to drop something there. But other than that, there's a handful of spots I'll stop along the way. If you have any questions, you can add them at that point or even ahead of time, and I'll keep an eye on it. So I always start this presentation with a little story. So this is a photo of me from back in many years ago at this point, back in New Jersey when I used to live in one place, and I went out with a friend to do some waterfowl photography in the winter. So this story gives you a little bit of an idea of my approach to bird and wildlife photography. So in the winter in New Jersey, it's one of these crazy cold mornings. And I arrived there with my friend, meet up with my friend, and it's a good hour before sunrise. We got to get in and settled and set up before the ducks even arrive. So that way we don't scare them before it gets light. And so we have to walk in the dark, no flashlights, can't use a flashlight because that'll scare the ducks that are there. And so we kind of weave through this trail and get ourselves set up. And my friend, she's going to photograph from the shoreline. So she's laying there. And I decided on this particular outing, I was going to go in my in my dry suit and get in the water because I wanted to use this new setup I had at the time, this underwater housing, to try and photograph the birds from a different vantage point and try and do something a little different. So it was so cold that morning, I had to break through the ice, a little thin layer of ice on the surface to get in the water. So I do that. And I was really excited on this one because I had done this a few times before, but this was the first time where I'd finally purchased these new electronic heated socks, battery operated socks to keep my feet warm, because the rest of my body I was always able to layer up just fine, but my feet would always freeze after about a half hour of being in cold water like this. So I get in the water and get all set up, and I'm sitting there, and it's still pretty dark out. We're waiting for the light to come up, and as I'm sitting there, I kind of notice like really feeling a little cold, colder than normal. But I shrug it off and think everything's going to be fine. And then as it goes another 5 minutes, I'm like, man, I'm feeling a little colder, and it also feels like I feel like my leg is getting a little wet. That's kind of odd. That shouldn't be happening in this dry suit. So I wait another couple minutes, and then I'm like, yep, it's happening. There's definitely something going wrong here. My leg, I can definitely feel the water. And now I'm starting to freak out because I've got these battery operated socks on, and I'm worried the water is going to run down and short out and electrocute my feet or something. I don't know what's going to happen. So I get my stuff together and break through the ice again and get out, which sucks because, at that point, it's starting to get brighter. I don't want to disturb the ducks. Anyway, I get out and realize my zipper just wasn't sealed all the way on the dry suit. So I yank it shut and kind of think about it for a moment and realize we're already there. So I'm gonna get back in, and I get back in the water, and this is the photo that my friend took of me once the sun came up out there trying to take photos. And I was able to get through it. I stayed about an hour in the water before I got too cold and had to come back out. But the reason I do all this kind of stuff and damn near electrocute myself, thankfully I didn't, is to get photos like this. It's to try and do something different. And I certainly am not trying to encourage anybody here to do the crazy stuff like that I was doing. But the point is, I want you to think about things differently. So what's one of the first things we learn about as bird and wildlife photographers? And that's the lighting, okay? And the first thing we usually learn is to have the sun behind your back. So just strong sun shining in on your subject, and it works wonderfully. I'm gonna bring the camera settings up here on the screen so you guys can see it as I go along as well. And this works great, right? It shows the detail on our subject. It shows the colors on our subject. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. But it can be kind of standard, you know? And so this is how we all generally start out, is put that sun behind you. And then the next evolution is, well, let's start getting a little bit more specific with that and get into golden hour. And for anybody not familiar with the term, it's just the term for the first hour of light of the day or the last hour of light of the day. And depending on where you are, especially if any of you are unfortunate enough to be in a desert climate, you know, it's probably more of like the golden 10 to 15 minutes. It's not very often it goes a full hour where you get that quality of light, but it's still the same light. The sun is coming in from behind us, over our shoulder, shining in our subject, but now it's lower in the sky. And if you can get it when it first comes up or right before the sun sets, the quality of light is so much better. The colors are so much more vivid and rich, and you get just this more forgiving, beautiful quality of light. Sometimes it really glows those orange and golden colors. And so that's usually the light you really want to start to strive for, is trying to get into that golden hour before the light gets too harsh, or you know, you just don't have that strong sun during the middle of the day. So the next evolution for me past that golden hour light was to start shooting even earlier. So if I was going out in the morning, let's shoot at dawn before the sun even comes up. And if I stay for sunset, let's shoot at dusk after the sun goes down. And the thing is, you start to push your camera settings a little bit more, but that's the beauty of today's cameras. We can shoot at slower shutter speeds. We can shoot at higher ISOs. With the stabilization that these lenses and cameras provide, we can get amazing photos, and we start to get these beautiful colors that we never get to see otherwise. You know, before the sun comes up or just after it goes down, you get these beautiful pastel purples and pinks and sometimes oranges, right? Just all these lovely dawn dusk colors and beautiful soft light that comes with it as well. And so it's a wonderful time to be out photographing stuff, and one that I encourage everybody to try. If you're a morning person, get out there earlier. If you're an evening person, just stay after that sun goes down. Because the birds and wildlife are usually still there, and the colors can just be incredible. I love that time of day. It's one of my favorites to shoot. And you can even shoot some action sometimes, you know? It's really nice. This was a long-tailed Jaeger up in Nome, Alaska when I run my workshops up there. And it's really cool because you can get dusk light like this at 3 a.m. in the morning. You get light all night long, so it's really fun. So the next evolution for me was to start shooting into the dark, start really pushing myself for really early morning or staying well past sunset. And this is when I really start pushing settings. And you'll notice, like, for example here, 40th of a second at 12,800 ISO. But again, with the quality of what these cameras can provide and noise reduction software that we have these days, you can get away with it. But shooting into the night and really incorporating urban lighting in the background for creative effects can be really fun. Just using a street light in the back like this to fake a moon in the background. And here's another example of a burrowing owl in Florida with just another headlight, I think this one was, in the background as a car was driving by. Or city lights far off in the background at the Great Salt Lake. All of these things can provide some really interesting, beautiful, creative bird photography. But you got to be willing to really push the settings, you know, 40th of a second at 6,400 ISO. I'm really pushing my settings low. When I was shooting these night herons, I was actually in the water with them at night in a cove down in Florida along the coastline and getting knocked around by waves. I was out there hand holding my 400-2.8 and really pushing my settings, 15th of a second handheld at 8,000 ISO, right? But this is the kind of stuff you can do. If you practice with the gear that you have, you can shoot in these crazy slow shutter speeds, 1/8 of a second handheld. Is this image tack sharp? Hell no, it's certainly not. But is it sharp enough to get away with? Absolutely. And so These are the kinds of things I love to do. And this is one that is actually sharp, you know, at a sixth of a second, I was just resting my camera on my knee and just trying to do anything I could to get the shot there. But I love trying to push myself and my camera and my gear into these really dark hours to try and get stuff. And then every once in a while you get lucky and a screech owl comes and lands on the palm tree right next to your campsite while you got a campfire. So this is actually a gray morph eastern screech owl, but he looks so orange because it's lit by a campfire. And so in any case, shooting into the dark can be really fun. All right, so back to just some regular light. Strong directional light is another lighting style that I love to use. So in the beginning, I talked about having that light right over your back, shining onto the subject during golden hour as well. But what happens if we start to put that sun coming in from the side? We start to get some dramatic side lighting. It can create some really interesting lighting. We can find backgrounds in the shade compared to our subject out in the sun and create these interesting dramatic spotlit effects. It's one of my favorite things to do is have the sun on my subject and then my background go completely black. And I see a few questions coming in here about that night stuff, so I'll answer that really quick. So Carolyn Woods asked, during the night photography, are you on manual? I'm not sure if you mean manual exposure or manual focus, but it's usually manual exposure for me. I'm not using auto ISO because I really need to dial it in, and when it's that dark, and a lot of the times, I'll just hop back real quick, exposing for these lights in the background, the camera kind of doesn't know what to do on its own. And then some of the times, a lot of these, I did have to manually focus them. So I would manually focus to get it close. I would actually use on the Z9 I was using, I zoom in on the viewfinder itself to get to 100% where I'm seeing the accurate sharpness. And then I fine tune the manual focus there and then take my photo so I can make sure I get sharp images there. And then someone else asks, am I using flash when shooting at night? On all these examples, I am not. I have done it a handful of times, and I can't remember if I have anything in this presentation about it. I might, but in general, all of these that you're seeing are not. So yes, Caroline is clarifying exposure. So yes, manual exposure for all of these. If you keep an eye out right here, you can see when I'm on manual, or sometimes I'll switch over to aperture priority. So great questions, keep them coming. All right, so moving right along. Finding the sun shining on your subject, or even soft light on your subject, but the background and shade, incredibly dramatic light. So I love working with the sun coming in from an angle, giving me some other dramatic light to play with versus just having it come in straight behind you. And then for me, a lot of the times I seek out those dark backgrounds, those backgrounds with shade, so I can get this sort of dark studio lit kind of look. And here's an example of one of my favorite examples of that, is having this common loon chick hanging out on mom's back in that beautiful directional strong light. All right, so some of the other things, some of the other lighting. Overcast lighting. So I hear it quite often from a lot of photographers that I know that say, you know, they only had a chance to go out and shoot on the weekend, but it was cloudy all day, so they didn't bother going. I often think that's a missed opportunity. You know, overcast light, while there's less of it, again, our cameras and these lenses can easily handle it with slower shutter speeds and higher ISOs. And if you really pay attention and just find yourself a nice soft background, or a colorful background is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, has some tone, some green, some tree line. You can get beautiful, beautiful photos in soft overcast light, especially when working with some colorful birds like these warblers like this. And one other thing I really like to talk about with this is just like this example. If you think about being in a forest with a lot of branches and trees and leaves and stuff like that, if I have sunlight beaming through that, there are bright spots, there's dark spots, there's shadows casted everywhere. You know, the sun's shining off of a leaf and reflecting back really bright and overexposing. It can look chaotic and harsh with your lighting. Or you have to be very specific and get the bird just in the right spot. Well, with overcast light, you can be in the forest and there's really no hard, heavy shadows anywhere. So you get to just point in any direction, and we get to really make beautiful photos in all kinds of lighting, or all kinds of overcast light like this, and just shoot all day. That's the other thing that's really nice about overcast light is I jokingly talked about that golden 15 minutes of light sometimes when the sun is really harsh. Well, if it's overcast, you get to be out all day and you can make beautiful photos with it. So I definitely recommend and encourage people to go out and photograph in overcast light. Just make sure you have something interesting in the background, some good color or some good tone, so you're not just shooting up towards a boring gray sky. And you can make beautiful photos in that light, you know? But the other thing you can do with that overcast light is lean into it. Let the background go bright. Capture a high key photo. Let this gray, normally gray blah sky, go completely white. And so just like that sort of strong directional light we use for the dark black background, this is the opposite. So we get that clean, minimalist look. And if we have a really cool perch like we do with these Florida scrub jays, with just a simple white background, there's nothing else for us to notice as the viewer, you know? It can really simplify a scene to make it all about the subject. And so this is another time where, again, I don't shy away from shooting in overcast light. I just try to lean into it and just do more exposing for my subject and let that background go light. And so a lot of times it's a little bit more positive exposure compensation, or just dialing it in, your exposure, so that the background just kind of washes out and loses detail. And when you have a stunning bird like this redneck phalarope, it can stand on its own in that beautiful color. Or we can do the same kind of effect with snow and get things to just be kind of a little bit more minimal, simple, and just that sort of lighter high key look. All right, so I'm just going to take a quick break here. Any other questions about the lighting section before we move on to the next one? All right. So the next thing for me that I use creatively with my bird photography is space in the image. This has kind of become what the thing I'm known for with my photography, and I love capturing birds small in frame. And one of the main reasons, there's a bunch of reasons, I'm going to go over them, but one of the main reasons is to show off a little bit of the habitat of where our subject lives and tell a little bit more of the story of that subject. So for example, this beautiful hooded warbler. Imagine if I photographed this thing close up, filled the frame with it. Of course, I would see the lovely details of this hooded warbler. They are a stunning bird with very unique coloration on them, and that would be great. But I would have no idea where this bird lives, what the habitat looks like, or what the conditions are like in that moment if I photographed it just frame filling. And so I love to back up a lot of the times and capture my subject a little bit smaller in frame and start to show off that habitat. So now we get to see he's on this mossy covered log in this beautiful lush forest. You know, we get to see this loon with an incredible mountainscape of Mount Baker in the background and a full moon setting back there. All of this is available to us when we zoom back out or physically step away. And it doesn't need to be with a short focal length all the time. I'm going to show some of those later, but look at all these. These are all longer focal lengths, 400 millimeter to still show off that habitat, 200 millimeter here to show off a really unique habitat for this wood duck, you know? And so I love trying to have my subject small in frame, but here's the key. This is the important part for me, is to make that subject still be the star of the show. I want you to see the eastern meadowlark first before you notice the burnt charred grasses from this controlled burn area in Florida. I want you to see this row of avocets before you notice the beautiful mountainscape in the background. And I want you to see this snowy egret first before you start to notice these foggy conditions in this wide open marsh space. So that to me is the key of backing up and using space to tell a little bit more story, is make that subject stand out, make them still be the star of the show, but let's show off some of this beautiful habitat. When these birds live in places like the Sandhill Crane with the incredible mountains in Alaska in the background, why not try and show off those mountains, or this very unique shoreline along the coast of Georgia that has all these dead trees that are just right on the coast, you know? Let's actually include some of that and show it off with this black-bellied plover, okay? And one of the other things we can show off when we start to use space like this as well is weather conditions. And so if we have unique weather like snow and we include more space, we get to show off more of that. All right. So showing off that habitat or weather conditions like that is one of my favorite things to do. And this Louisiana water thrush is a perfect example. You know, if I had just photographed this bird close up on that perch on the top there with a nice blurred background, it would look beautiful, it'd be a beautiful portrait. And I certainly try to take those as well. But instead, I backed up in this case and I photographed him over top of the river and that stream, which is such an important part of this bird's story. This is where these birds live. This is where they make their living. This is where they find their food and where they have their nests. In this case, this was in South Pennsylvania. And so backing up and telling that story, I think, can really help you out when you can show off more of the habitat of the species you're working with. And sometimes it can even be a man-made object with this yellow-throated warbler who is just nailing it with all the spiders and spider webs that were caught up in that barn like that. All right, another question I see in the chat from Cynthia is exposure compensation last thing you do after you've optimized your other settings? Why not just reduce or bump the ISO? So Cynthia, great question. So for me, If I'm in manual exposure mode, almost always I'm just doing a manual ISO as well. So I do everything manual when I go into manual mode. And so the times that you're seeing exposure compensation here is when I'm using aperture priority and auto ISO. And so you can't change your ISO when it's in auto ISO. The only control you have to change your exposure is exposure compensation to go lighter or darker. And the reason I use those settings, aperture priority with auto ISO, is usually where I'm photographing things where I'm not really sure where they're going to be. It's changing lighting conditions. They might come up in a shaded area or a brighter area. When things are changing a little bit faster, personally for me, I don't want to be fiddling with settings. So I go aperture priority with auto ISO. I tell the camera not to go below a certain shutter speed. So for me, most of the time it's 500th of a second. So the camera won't go below 500th of a second. And then all I have to think about, I don't have to think about my shutter speed. I don't have to think about my ISO. All I have to think about is, do I need to go lighter or darker with the exposure to get it to look the way I want? So that's why you're seeing a lot of exposure compensation. If I'm shooting fully manual, then I'm not using exposure compensation at all, and I'm adjusting my exposure with both my shutter speed and my ISO, and in which case, a lot of the times I will be just fluctuating my ISO to make that work. So great question. All right. The next thing that I use creatively with my bird photography is wide angle lenses, so shorter focal lengths. And listen, in wildlife, I call basically 100 millimeter and down is kind of in the wide angle territory. Honestly, for a lot of people, 200 millimeter and down feels wide angle compared to shooting 400, 500, 600, 800 millimeter. And so this is just to do this even more, to show off even more habitat than what I was doing in the previous images with the longer focal lengths and going smaller in the frame, right? And when we have incredible habitat like this yellow-headed blackbird I just photographed about a month ago at Mono Lake in California, they have these incredible tufa features is what they're called, with the Sierra Nevada mountains in the background and a beautiful sky like this. Why not show it off? And here's the key, right? I did still take a portrait, right? I had another camera set up with me with my big long lens on it, and I took a closer portrait of the bird, which looks great and shows a little bit of the mountains back there. But then I also was able to incorporate this entire landscape in with my bird there. And so starting to shoot shorter focal lengths, really getting in closer and more intimate with your subject is also a wonderful thing to do when you have cooperative subjects like these rock wrens, one of my favorites, and they hang out in some of the most beautiful places. When you can get physically close to your subject, instead of just, for me, absolutely filling the frame with it, I love to start using these shorter focal lengths and zooming out with these zoom lenses to show off this incredibly foggy forest or this red-tailed tropic bird chick hanging out on the cliff right here with a rainbow in the background along the Hawaii coastline. These are perfect examples to start using wide angle lenses, shorter focal lengths to make these subjects really stand out in these beautiful environments, you know? And in this example, we have a rainbow. Of course we want to show that off. And when you got the friendly birds in Florida that are used to being around all these fishermen and walk right up to you, why not shoot them with a shorter focal length like 30 millimeter here? Or getting all the way close out below 30 millimeter when you're on the stunning coastline of Newfoundland with this incredible foggy sunset. So these are the times where I love to start doing that when I have birds that I can get really close to, like this guy, this brown noddy was very, very cooperative. I waded out in the water to my chest and was able to walk right up to him and stick my lens in his face. Honestly, I did it very slowly and cautiously. And then here's the best part about this, and this is a very important part, right? Is to make sure I'm not disturbing them. And so I work with wide angle lenses with birds that are tolerant, acclimated to people, or just don't have a fear of people like these seabirds like this noddy. And I was able to walk up, take this photo and walk away without him even taking, he didn't even move, right? He just stayed right there. And so not disturbing your subject is key there. So that is an important part that I want to mention. But I love, love, love incorporating these beautiful landscapes with these birds and trying to show off this stunning space where you can kind of not do it any other way by doing if you were stuck with a long focal length, you wouldn't be able to really incorporate these spaces like that. But the key is, again, I want you to really pay attention to this as I'm going through this presentation, especially with the smaller in frame stuff, is to make sure your subject stands out. This was photographed at 10 millimeter, folks. This spoonbill down in Florida at a rookery flew, I'm not exaggerating, probably about 5 feet over my head. That's how close that bird was with this. But because I was using a wide angle lens, an extremely wide angle lens in this case, I was able to show off all the habitat around him. And look at that. He's like, bam, right there, that beautiful pink wing spread right in the sky, really calling for attention, right? Or a wedge-tailed shearwater doing the same thing off the coast of Hawaii, or a northern gannet flying over top of the colony there. Each time, even though I was photographing these birds at 10 millimeter, an incredibly wide focal length. The bird is the star of the show. They're the main subject there. And then sometimes in this case, other birds or just the habitat um, is the secondary subject, okay? And so I love trying to play with these wide angle things, and I encourage you to try that, especially when you have birds that are very cooperative or tolerant if you can. One of the other things that space provides in an image is to show off the size, and usually that is to show off how small something is. And it's great to do with baby birds like this baby sandhill crane. But if we show these birds with a little bit more space around them, they get to seem smaller. They get to seem more dainty in their environment. And sometimes it can really show how just incredibly tiny they are in this huge landscape that they live in, right? A golden-winged warbler just looking like a leaf here, okay? Another thing we can do with space is show off more beautiful color. If you've got beautiful green grass like this, let's show it off. If you've got beautiful purple flowers throughout an entire field, let's show it off. Instead of cropping in close, you have these incredible skies, some beautiful color somewhere, some autumn colors. Let's give our subject a little bit more space in the frame and include more of that beautiful color. And sometimes it can just be as simple as that beautiful smooth green background that's far off in the distance, right? It doesn't have to be some crazy sunset or anything like that. One more thing that I get to include with interesting space is foreground. All right, so interesting foregrounds. If I shoot through stuff, I start to get interesting textures. The foreground blurs and can actually simplify what would otherwise be a busy scene with this indigo bunting. Same thing here with this tree swallow, but these autumn colors were in the foreground tree against a mostly green background. And so I was able to put those splashes of color in there. And it makes things, to me, it starts to make things look like a little bit more of a painting. And so I specifically seek this out. I try to find small openings through, in this case, tree trunks or bushes like this that I can shoot through to create interesting textures and use for framing my subject. The other thing I start to look for with the foreground is sparkling bubbles or anything usually in and around water that can turn into these kind of bokeh balls. And so for anybody not familiar, this is what happens basically if you have specular highlights. So think Christmas lights, like little tiny points of light. And if you shoot that with a telephoto lens and throw it out of focus, the things that are out of focus start to become these larger balls of light. And so they could be in the foreground and or the background like you see here. And when I have them in the foreground, I definitely love to try and incorporate them on purpose. This usually means you're shooting into the sun. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the presentation. And it can even just be the sun shining off grains of sand on a beach like that to create that stuff, or a splash from a nearby duck. All right. So any questions on my use of space there before we start talking about photographing stuff really close? I'm just going to take a sip of water. Go ahead and just drop them in the chat or the Q&A, whatever works for you guys. All right, so I just got done sharing all about how I love to photograph birds small in frame with wide angle lenses and show off all this space. But I'm certainly not opposed to photographing them close as well. And for me, when I start photographing them close, I want to really fill the frame or sometimes make it so that I can't even fit the bird in the frame. But it's a lovely thing to do. I totally understand it, and I still do it when the opportunity arises. Why not show off incredible, beautiful feather detail and coloration and plumage like on this stunning bufflehead? This isn't something we get to see all the time in the field, so it's nice to be able to do that with these long telephoto lenses and high-resolution sensors. But when I can, I love to get really close. And like I said, not even let the whole bird fill the frame. So that same wide angle northern gannet shot you saw earlier, I shot at 24 millimeter showing the whole colony in the background. I also shot him that same time with my 400 millimeter, really close. So trying to get it so the bird can't even fit in the frame. So it's just all about the interesting details and plumage, or an interesting feature like the beautiful beak of these white ibis and this incredible eye. Or the lovely plumage of a red-shouldered hawk down in Florida, or the angry expression of a Florida scrub jay staring me down hardcore there. So things like this beating up water drops on this common loon, all these kinds of details you wouldn't be able to see if I was doing small in frame. So I think there's certainly something creative to do when you get close. And when you have birds that are really friendly, like these brown pelicans down in Florida, for me, I start to get really close, trying to make abstract patterns out of them, just the water drop on the beak of a wood stork. All right, so getting close can certainly be a creative thing. Another creative tool I use is action, and this is one that kind of speaks for itself, right? Instead of just having your bird sitting on a perch or floating in the water, if we can introduce action usually revolving around hunting or feeding. It's a great thing, right? So birds in flight can be wonderful, but feeding time is wonderful, like these black skimmers and their very unique feeding behavior, or the splash of a snowy egret trying to catch some prey. All right, so trying to capture that movement, that action, that behavior certainly elevates our photos and can be another creative technique that we can be sure to use in our bird photography. And I love trying to capture that stuff too. I don't do it as much as I'd like, but when it's presented, I definitely try to capture that. Another action is interaction. And so a lot of times this is between, adults and their young. So feeding behaviors, and they can be wonderful tender moments that you can capture and share. Like these Kentucky warblers with their young in a nest built out of dead leaves, or a common loon feeding its young, a wonderful moment between the pair. But it can also be just like defensive behavior sometimes, like this black skimmer trying to guard its territory from a common tern trying to fly in. So any of these kinds of interactions can be wonderful, or it can be mating like these least terns. If you've never had the privilege of watching tern mating sequence, it's pretty hilarious. So the male, obviously on the top in this case, goes out, catches a fish, and comes back and then tries to present it to any female that will accept his prized catch. So needless to say, guys, you see a lot of males just wandering around the beach trying to show off the fish and no females taking it. It happens a lot. But if she likes the fish he brought back, she accepts it, and then they get to mate. So courtship behavior is another wonderful interaction. Here's a sandhill crane looking like a complete goofball trying to impress the mate that was nearby. All right. So some other really fun things, takeoffs and landings. Just birds in flight in general can be really wonderful, but during takeoffs and landings, that to me is when birds are at their most extreme. So for a landing, they got to slow down just so they can stop and land in a certain spot. For a takeoff, they've got to really power into it and use their wings just to get the lift that they need. So we get extreme positions, both from takeoffs and landings, that we normally don't get when the bird is just kind of cruising through the sky. And so I love trying to sort of concentrate on those specific moments for the birds in flight, especially if you can get a silly bufflehead duck like this just as the moment his feet touch down and he skims across the water. Ducks just in general look silly when they're trying to come in and land. Or a powerful bald eagle that just took off the ground flying through the snow, right? All of these things create interesting positions from these birds and interesting action. And one of the other actions is preening. Preening is a great behavior where the birds are cleaning themselves up. You get these crazy ruffled out moments. A lot of the times, right after a preening session, if you're not familiar with this, almost every bird after a big preening session is going to flap, especially if they're in and around the water. If they're bathing, they're definitely going to flap to dry off, or they're going to just come up and try and turn to get just that right feather, So these preening behaviors can be wonderful. And you can also capture some really unique stuff. This prairie warbler lived in a salt marsh in Florida. And this is a sea grape plant. So the only way this bird had access to fresh water to bathe in was to actually rub its body on the morning dew on the plant, because there was no other fresh water around. So that's what it did. It rubbed itself all over the plant, got nice and wet, and then sat there and bathed itself and did a preening session. So something very unique and cool you can capture by concentrating on this preening behavior. Playing with slower shutter speeds to let the motion happen while the bird is flapping, and getting a royal tern who just, I gotta say, they're one of the tops. They so get into it when they're in the water bathing like that. It's really, really funny. So preening is wonderful. And then capturing motion on purpose. So using slower shutter speeds to pan with your subject. And then your goal is to try and move at the same speed and direction as your subject and get, at least for me, I try to get their head, or at least their eye and bill sharp, and then let the rest of the body blur or the background blur, And you can get some really interesting looks and movement out of the photos by doing that. And so it's something I love to try and do with these slower shutter speeds when I have subjects in, especially when it's not enough light to capture the action. So in this case, it was actually nighttime. That's like a street light reflecting in the water in the background. There was no way, if I set my camera with enough shutter speed to capture this black skimmer sharp, my ISO would have been through the roof. It would have been a grainy mess. So instead, I went with a slow shutter speed and tried to do some panning and try to make things look interesting. So in low light conditions, if you've got some birds in flight, it can be really fun to try. And you can also combine it with some wide angle photography like this and do wide angle motion blurs as well for a very unique, interesting effect. Okay. Motion can also happen if you're around some moving water, just by getting your subject sharp, holding really still. And this is the kind of stuff, folks, I very, very rarely ever shoot with a tripod. And so this was all done handheld. All of those previous shots were done handheld as well. So this was me just hand holding at 1/10 of a second, holding really still and hoping this black oyster catcher didn't move while the big waves on the Pacific Ocean crashed in the background. And you get movement like this. And here's another example. This one was on a tripod because this was shot at a full 1/2 a second. So when I get into anything less than about 1/10 of a second, I can't really hand hold it much anymore. But shooting into these movements where you're starting to get handheld motion. And I guess here, this photo speaks to, I guess I can go a little bit lower. This was handheld at 1/5 of a second. But trying to get that water movement can be really wonderful. Another thing is pre-capture. So anybody who has one of the newer modern cameras that has pre-capture on it, which is basically taking the photo on a rolling continuation and then saving it after you've pressed it, so you can actually shoot into the past. You can actually capture a lot of action that's too hard to react to. A question just came in about the slow shutter stuff from Scott Kinsey. He asks, do you use your tripod only when you have a slow shutter speed? Yes, correct. Only, and that's only when I'm going really slow. Like this stuff, 1/5, 1/10 of a second, I do all that handheld anyway. But when I'm getting, this was like 1/2 a second. I've done some of these at this particular location, which is a seabird colony in Newfoundland. I've done some of these up to like, 1 second, 2 second, 3 second exposures. And those, there's no way I can hold them still. So that's the one and only time I'll use a tripod. Other than that, everything else I shoot is handheld. The only other time I'll use a tripod is if I know I'm going to be in one spot consistently doing birds in flight, then I'll occasionally use a tripod, but that's even rare. And then the only other time is like when I sit in a hide. If I'm going to be sitting in a hide, not moving, just waiting for a subject, like when I photograph belted kingfishers and stuff like that, then I will use support. And then also when I'm shooting on like in shallow water, I'll use a ground pod. So basically like a plastic frisbee with a ball head mounted on it or a gimbal. And I'll use that to support the camera so I don't have to hold it the whole time right over the water. But those are the only times I use support. Other than that, everything else I shoot is handheld. All right, so pre-capture. These birds, especially these small songbirds, they take off so fast. I kind of timed it out one time just by looking at how fast the bird moves through the frame. They'll, like a warbler like this, will go from in the frame to out of the frame in like about 1/4 of a second. And so it's usually often too fast to react to. And so in these moments where these small, fast moving birds are taking off and flying out of the frame, pre-capture can be wonderful because you can actually watch them go, then press the shutter, and then have the whole sequence captured, right? So I was able to use pre-capture to basically kind of make it easy to do a bunch of small songbirds and warblers taking off and flying, just like this black-throated green warbler, all right? So some other tools I use for creativity are photographing from a hide. So I don't do it as much anymore because I live on the road and photographing from a hide, you kind of really need to learn a place and really know it well. But every once in a while, I still have a small portable camo throw hide I'll use. But when I lived in New Jersey, especially with working with waterfowl, or like I had previously just mentioned, a belted kingfisher, who, if you've ever tried to photograph a kingfisher, everybody knows these birds suck, right? They will fly away at a moment's notice when from really far away. They're cackling and it sounds like they're laughing at you as they fly away. They're really tough birds. But I worked for years with these guys trying to get setups and be able to sit in a hide and photograph them. And so that can be a really creative tool, right? To be able to get into areas and work with birds that otherwise wouldn't let you get close. And I gotta say, it is a wonderful thing to be able to watch your subjects moving around and just behaving naturally when they otherwise wouldn't if they knew you were there. Even if they would tolerate you somewhat, they would keep a farther distance or just the behavior would change. And so being in a hide can be really, really fun. And it's basically, here's how I describe it. It's a long period of boredom with all of a sudden some incredible action. Usually that's how it works, when your subject finally comes into view, like these secretive clapper rails. But using a hide can be a wonderful experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I used a floating hide for this particular series of photos with this black skimmer. They were flying so close to me while I was in this floating hide, I could hear their water slicing, or their bill slicing through the water as they flew right by me feeding like this. It was incredible, incredible experience. All right, folks. So a couple more lighting things I like to use for creativity. Silhouette is one of my favorites. I love trying to just reduce a subject to their shape. And so if we think about this, here's the really important thing for me with bird photography silhouettes is It's all about the shape. And so I want my viewer to be able to identify at least the type of bird, or sometimes the exact bird, based on just the silhouette of its shape. So anybody want to give a guess in the chat what this species might be? I'll give you a hint. It was photographed in Florida. But even if you don't know exactly what species it is, you can tell it's some sort of wading bird. And so it's a wonderful thing to be able to make sure you pay attention to the shape of your bird when you're photographing them as a silhouette, because you think about it, we've just reduced our subject into a shape. That's really all they are. And the first person guessed it correct, a great blue heron. So look at that. Just by the silhouette, one of the viewers in the group here was able to guess that, and that's exactly what I want. But I also want to show off a lot of the habitat. Okay, if you get these incredible sunsets, this just happened for me a week or two ago at the Great Salt Lake with an American avocet. So we have these unbelievable, scenes and colors and details in the background. Sometimes it's really fun to show it off, right? To just reduce your subject and their perch into a silhouette when you have these beautiful sunrise and sunset colors in the background, okay? Because it's near impossible most times to expose for them and the background. It's just generally not going to work. So when we make that silhouette, let's find some interesting perches. Let's find some interesting shapes and textures, like just the rippled sand on this beach here, or some really cool grasses curving in the marsh grass, or just silhouette them against like the reflected sky. So it looks like in this case, it looks like the tricolor heron is almost just floating up in the sky, sitting in the clouds. But meanwhile, it's just sitting in some shallow water in the marsh, So I love using these silhouettes to do that, to show off those beautiful skies, those beautiful colors, get some interesting shapes there. Some interesting behaviors, we can do that as well. So capture birds fishing and feeding. Or if you get some incredible, beams of light shining out of the clouds like that. My fiance and I were out in this lake. It was Caddo Lake in Texas, and we were paddling all around, just trying to line up this great blue heron with that one, especially that one strong beam of light back there. And thankfully he stayed put and we were able to make that happen. Right. But silhouette stuff like this, I love trying to do it and capture some splashes of the water, or it can even be flocks of birds like this at the Great Salt Lake as well. Sometimes you don't even need the bird in the frame. It can be just their shadow. Okay. So that's just the shadow of a snowy egret on a rock. With some low light kind of shining onto that rock. And this is one of the perfect examples I like to show about how you can use a silhouette as a creative tool. So this is an ovenbird in southern New Jersey. And when I first photographed this bird, it flew up onto this perch, and I pointed my camera at it and I took this shot. This is what it looked like. All right. So this is what the habitat looked like to me. And I took probably a couple of frames of this, and I thought to myself, this isn't very exciting. The perch is kind of just this dead branch. It's kind of boring. The lighting's not that exciting. There's nothing really to write home about this other than to show off an ovenbird, which is a cool warbler species. But I quickly realized, and this all happened within probably less than 30 seconds. I took a couple of frames like this. I noticed these bright areas of sun or light filtering through the trees in the background. And so I moved over, lined up the bird with one of those. I dialed in -2 1/3 stops of exposure compensation to silhouette the bird, and then I photographed it like this. What I didn't anticipate was the bird was going to profile to me and sing in that moment, and then it flew off. All right, so there was a little bit of luck there, but this to me is so much more creative and interesting to look at than this, just a bird sitting on kind of a boring perch. And so the other nice thing is once I realized that, once I learned that, I was able to start seeking it out. And so I did a whole series of songbirds silhouetted in the forest, sometimes against just the green grasses, sometimes up against the trees. And then my silhouettes got a little bit more complicated. When I was out in the open beaches and marshes, I started specifically trying to photograph the birds in the reflected sun. So not just against the brighter background, but specifically in the sun reflecting in the water. And then I started to actually try and include the sun in the frame with those birds, those silhouetted birds in the background, or put them directly over top of the sun to kind of block it out. And here's another great example of including the sun in the frame itself. And then from there, I started to move into trying to actually silhouette the bird inside the sun. And that is sort of how I evolved with this stuff, is just keep making it more complicated and more challenging, but to create some really unique stuff. And if anybody had been on the beach and saw me running down the beach with my 500mm lens on my shoulder, trying to line up this American oyster catcher before it went over the hill, they probably would have been cracking up or wondering what in the hell I was doing running down the beach. And it's so funny talking about shape, right? So I kind of saw this bird heading towards this hill, this sand dune. And I knew if I ran down and lined it up, I could maybe put him in the sun because he was out pretty far. And so I did that. I started heading down there. And as he got to the top of the hill, he was walking the other way. He was just facing away from me. And I'm probably not exaggerating when I say I think I yelled out loud, "Turn your head!" Because at first, if you think about an oyster catcher, if they're just facing straight towards you or away from you, they kind of just look like a bowling pin, you know? They don't have much shape to them. It would have just looked like this blob up there. And thankfully, the bird turned and profiled. I don't know if it was because I was yelling, probably not. It was pretty far away on a beach with crashing waves. But he turned and then he walked down the hill on the other side. And so I got that shot that I was after. But as you can see in all of these silhouettes, it's all about the shape of the bird. And sometimes you don't have to do much. I was just photographing this sunset. The pelican flew into the frame and then I got the shot, right? So sometimes you get lucky and it works out, but other times I work really hard to try and line up that bird in that sun. And it can be really, really incredible when things line up and you're able to make that happen. I definitely use really extreme exposures. You can see 8,000th of a second here at 160 ISO. You can see here 26,000th of a second at f11 at 160 ISO to be able to get an exposure in that sun. And so the key for me is with a lot of these, all these shots you've probably just seen with the sun in the frame, is my goal is to get an actual exposure in the sun. I don't just want an overexposed white ball, which is what happens a lot of times, but when that sun gets lower to the horizon, like it did here, this was at the Great Salt Lake just a couple weeks ago, one of the most amazing sunsets I've ever watched. The sun, basically the water goes out so far and it was so calm. The sky melts into the water and you have this endless horizon. There is no horizon. It's just sky, water. You can't even tell the difference. And so when the sun touched down and started basically setting into itself, it was a pretty unique thing. And I had a couple of avocets way out there, really far out actually. But the key is to set the exposure to be able to see detail in the sun. So look, color in the sun, color in the sun, color in the sun, pretty much every time. That's what I'm trying to do. So some of the times you have humidity and or thin clouds like you see here that cut the power of the sun, or you just let the sun go all the way down to the horizon. Like if you're in an area in an open marsh like this in New Jersey, where I'm able to watch the sun just coming up. This was a sunrise actually. Right in the beginning, I can easily expose for it, you know? All right, so a couple of questions coming in here. Mary asks, do you ever shoot in burst mode? Yeah, these are all in burst mode. So I generally shoot 6 frames a second. That's the burst that I use. I assume that's what you're talking about, like frames per second, like a burst of images. I don't just take photos with like a single shot. So if that's not your question, please clarify. But yes, that is what all that is. Where do I like to photograph at the Great Salt Lake? I run my workshops mostly around Antelope Island, so that's where that is. But I go, like for this, I actually had a client with me, and I take everybody out in the lake. We actually like walk out in the lake and get really, 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 I can't even exaggerate it anymore, really messy. Just completely, yeah, just gross, smelly mud everywhere. It's a little challenging to not get it all over the camera because it's really salty, so it's not good for the gear. But yes, I go out in the lake to be able to get opportunities like this. Stuff like this, you generally, it's not impossible, but mostly you just can't get from a shoreline. So it's another one of those examples where you got to put in a lot of work to get to unique places like this. Next question, advice for those of us who can't be flat on the ground or next to the water surface level. So my advice there is get good with your flip screen. So I had a few people actually recently that I was working with at the Great Salt Lake who weren't able to lay down flat and like get their neck, you know, bent down and look prone into the camera. And so you practice getting good with your flip screen. In fact, this one, I was sitting upright. I wasn't laying down. I was just sitting there in the mud. I had my camera on a ground pod and I used my flip screen to be able to look down at it and capture it. So that is my best advice for you in that circumstance, is to simply just get good with that flip screen. And I use my flip screen all the time for all kinds of circumstances, not just for getting low. That's the major reason, but all kinds of perspectives. There's times where I actually need to get my perspective higher and I'll hold my camera all the way up over my head, flip the screen down, and then compose the shot to line it up with whatever I'm trying to figure out and do. So it is really important to be able to get the perspective you want, whether that be high, low, left, right, back, forward, anything. And so that is what I use. I use that as a tool, and it's really convenient for me a lot of the times and clutch a lot of the times to be able to get the shots I want that I otherwise wasn't going to be able to get. And then one other thing is around water. When you can't get water level, And there's not much you can do about this because it's all weather-based, but wait for calm days. If it's really calm water, you don't have to be that low. You're going to get beautiful reflections. It's going to look great anyway. But if the water surface is ripply or not calm and you're not water level and your camera, I'm talking lens like, you know, a couple of inches off the water. If you're not doing that, then it's going to probably just look messy most of the time, the water. So wait for calm conditions is my other advice, which is certainly a lot harder to do and not in control. All right, so back to silhouettes. Remember, everything we're seeing right here in this section is all silhouette. So another thing I started to do was just use like urban lights to silhouette. This is just a light on the side of a building in the background with this burrowing owl, and that can be another fun thing to do. All right, my last lighting that I'm going to talk about, backlight. This is the same as silhouette. Generally, we're shooting towards the sun, and this is the complete opposite of what we usually learn in the beginning as bird photographers, to put that sun behind you shining in on your subject. Well, after a while, I started experimenting with shooting directly into that sun. And here's the difference between a silhouette and a backlight, right? The silhouette, our background is brighter than our subject, okay? And we silhouette our subject. So we expose for the background and our subject becomes the shadow. With backlight, we're looking for a mid-tone to darker background, and we're still shooting into the sun. So now, because we have a mid or darker background, we no longer have to silhouette our subject. We instead get to expose somewhat properly for our side of the subject, and we get a backlight, or a rim light is the other thing. We get this glow around our subject. And before we dive into that, I saw a couple of questions come into the chat. So let's see. Was your shutter speed choice here to keep from blowing out the sun? Absolutely, every single time. Yes, I expose extremely dark in those scenarios where I'm exposing for the sun. So like this one, in the original exposure, this is almost all black, right? But because I'm shooting at such a low ISO, I know I can recover that in post and get the details I want. So yes, I expose just for the sun, and I go extreme with it just to be able to get the detail, because if not, if I overexpose that sun, it's never coming back. The detail will not come back, right? There's no way around it. And it's a very small window. It doesn't take much to overexpose the sun. The sun is bright. And so I go extreme with my exposure just to be able to do that. The next question was, when the sun glares on the flip screen, how do you even see your composition? Is there a way to shade your flip screen? You are absolutely right. It is a pain. It is difficult. I found myself very often like huddling over top of it, trying to put it in my shadow, like my own shadow over it so I can see the screen. It is difficult. It's by far much more difficult than putting your eye in the viewfinder. It's harder to see composition. It's harder to see exposure properly. It's harder to see focus because we're looking at a tiny flip screen. When you put your eye in the viewfinder actually has magnification to it. So we see our scene much larger and clearer, and we don't have the sun shining in our face, right? So yes, it's harder, but if it's either that, like for this example, it's either that or laying my face down in the nastiest mud ever, I'm not going to do that. I'll push myself, right? But even I have limits. And so for me, the flip screen is a tool that I use to sort of makes balanced decision all the time, right? A, can I get myself down low and get my eye in the viewfinder? If the answer is yes, then I will go for that every single time. But B, am I willing to, right? So sometimes I'm not dressed to get completely messy and wet, but I want the low perspective. Well, flip screen's an advantage there. I can get that perspective without having to get in the water or mud or mess or whatever. Is the shot worth it? You know, like that kind of thing. And so I just sort of balance all this stuff. And here's the deal. Is it as good as the viewfinder? No. Is it sometimes better? Yes, because sometimes I can just flat out get to perspective I couldn't otherwise, you know? Sometimes I'm like laying on a rocky shoreline and I just, even if I could like get my eye in the viewfinder, I can't lay down to get the area I want. And so I'll hang the camera down there and use the flip screen. So it's more challenging to use, but it allows me to get shots that I couldn't otherwise. And so I fumble through it and I deal with it and just try to make the best of it. Thankfully, with newer modern cameras, the focus tracking is so good. Most of the time you can just almost ensure that your subject's in focus. And then, you know, because it locked in on my birds a lot of the times, I can just kind of compose it wherever I want and start moving around as long as I can see that screen. So yeah, it is challenging for sure, but it's worth it to be able to get those perspectives sometimes. All right, another question from Norma in the chat. Do you ever use a monopod? Norma, I used to use a monopod all the time when I shot this particular lens that you're seeing this image with, a 500mm f4. It was bigger and heavier. It was Nikon's older version. Nikon's 400 2.8 mirrorless lens is right there on the verge for me for hand holdable. So I can hand hold that lens, which is the heaviest, biggest lens I own. And so I'm comfortable hand holding it, and therefore I don't really use the monopod much at all. I do have one. Again, just like the tripod, every once in a while I find a scenario where it makes more sense, but most of the time I like the flexibility of just using the like being able to hand hold. And a lot more recently, I shoot much smaller, lighter lenses, so they're really easy to hand hold. But there's nothing wrong with that, you know. Um, and someone said, "Can you bring a dark tarp to put over your head to see the screen?" Sure, you certainly could. But I move around so much a lot of times when I'm shooting, unless it's one of those situations where I'm just in one place and not moving, then um, I would say, you know, it would be maybe a little cumbersome for me to do. And I gotta say, I've done it enough and practiced enough. I feel confident enough with it that there's very few scenarios where I feel like I can't just use it. You know, there's if the light is that bright and it's that sunny, honestly, I'm probably not out shooting anyway because the light's probably too harsh. So, you know, and when I'm shooting into the sun, well, the sun's not shining on my screen then. So I'm not worrying about the reflected sun at that point, you know? And if it was coming in from behind me, I could just put my body in front of it to block it and reflect it. So I usually find ways to work around it that I don't really feel that's necessary, but I think that's a solid idea if you're really struggling with seeing that on the screen. I wish they made them like non-glare screens. That would be much nicer, but you know, they don't. So back to this presentation, backlight. So we're shooting into the sun. We've got a mid-tone or darker background, and now we're starting to get glow. So instead of silhouetting our subject, we're getting this incredible glow, not only on our subject, but on the habitat around it. So we're getting sparkly bokeh. We're getting those bokeh balls that I was talking about coming with the light filtering through the trees in the background with this burrowing owl. We can also start to even light up their breath if we have a cold, calm morning, which can be really cool. You get the funky hairdo of a breeding plumage, snowy egret blowing in the wind, backlit. That glow is beautiful. I love doing that. So shooting into the sun is one of my favorites. And what I always generally try to do is seek out that mid, or for me, I'm always trying to find the darkest background I can find. So I can do things like this. I can shoot into that background, expose for my subject, and let the background go basically black or really dark and moody, and then have all that foreground water sparkling and giving me these incredible colors and patterns, or just going really dark with the exposure for just the outline-ish of a bird, or a hermit thrush in the forest glowing in that sun with the moss as well, or this lesser yellowlegs. And here's a great example. You can do a couple of things. You can expose where you can see a little bit of detail, right? I can see some of the plumage and the markings and the legs of this, I think this one was a lesser yellow legs. Or you can go really dark with the exposure and make it just about the rim light and the shape of the bird, and in this case, the splash of water that he just kicked up and the reflection there, right? So you can play with the exposure. This is the same bird, same lighting. I just did this one at 1,000th of a second and this one at 8,000th of a second, right? So just completely changing my exposure to be able to get the effect I want. And so playing around with shooting into the sun with that backlight, getting that glow. It's some of the most dramatic light I love to shoot in. I seek it out all the time whenever I can, whenever a scenario gives me an option. If I can move myself into position to shoot into the sun and get backlit, that's what I do. And every once in a while, things line up where there's so much humidity in the air, you can expose for your subject and the sun all in the same frame and get them backlit. I get that rim lit detail on this least turn and still expose for that sun in the background. Or you get a really crazy condition where this wood stork was in the warm water all night, roosting there, and then in the morning he took his foot out in the cold morning air and it started steaming. It looked like his foot was on fire with smoke like that. So all of this can be done with backlight. All right, so I'm going to finish up the presentation talking about some of the crazier stuff I like to do. And one of those was starting to use a floating hide. And here's me in that floating hide. This is one I built for myself many years ago, before there were a lot of commercial floating hides available. And so this is what it looked like. It actually allowed me to raise the camera. I ripped the legs off a tripod, mounted it onto there upside down, so I could lower the camera and move it up and down. And you could see here, I could get it down really low to the water and get out in the water and shoot stuff like this. A floating hide was really, really fun for me creatively. It allowed me to be out in the water and move around. It's the only kind of hide photography you can do where you can actually move and the subject just thinks you're kind of like a floating bush, you know? So it allowed me to get to some areas. And like I said, with these black skimmers, this one time I was in a pond a non-tidal pond in southern New Jersey in the marshes, and about 6 black skimmers flew into the pond just after sunrise, and for about an hour flew around me. I took thousands of frames. They were just flying and zipping all around right in front of me. It was just one of the most incredible experiences to see them from this perspective, to be in the water with them. And that's the other fun thing, is to get immersed in with your subject. Another thing I'm using lately is this is a TT Artisan 250 millimeter reflex lens, so AKA donut bokeh lens. So they're really inexpensive, which is fun, and it makes this crazy ringed or donut bokeh in the background where you would otherwise see normal, just circular pattern bokeh. It's a manual focus lens, so it's challenging to use, but it really does make things look not just that crazy bokeh, but this is with that lens. It can turn a scene into a very painterly look. The textures in the forest in the background take on another look entirely. So there's some hummingbirds down in Costa Rica I shot with it. Or you can, again, do that crazy donut bokeh pattern with some reflected light in the background, or even in your foreground. So that's been a really fun lens I love to play with lately and try and get some interesting effects. And I think they sell for like, I don't know, 250 bucks or something like that. Nothing too crazy. I no longer use the floating hide. I live in a van. I don't really have space for one. So I've actually switched over to an underwater housing. Again, I know this is extreme, right? But my whole point in sharing this kind of stuff is, again, to just encourage you to try something different. Try to, if you would like this, try to push yourself. Try to push your gear. And it doesn't have to be this way, but these are some of the ways I like to try and do things. Here's me in a small pond up in Alaska with a pair of Pacific loons. And let me tell you, I was floating out there in my dry suit. When they dove under me, I was a little nervous. I was like, please don't poke my dry suit. But they were totally calm and relaxed. They're actually in a pond where they're pretty acclimated to people. So they have a high tolerance compared to most normal loons up in that area. And so I was able to get photos like this and actually be out in the water with them. And using that floating hide allows me to lay in the surf like this, right? And get totally different perspectives, shooting back up against the shoreline instead of from the shoreline out towards the water. And even put the water, half the lens underwater to be able to get crazy effects like this that come up over top of the water line because there's water on the surface of my lens and doing all these crazy effects. And so I love shooting that underwater housing. And when I first got it, it was all about shooting telephoto. So I was able to get 420 millimeter in an underwater housing using the lenses I have, and able to get crazy unique effects. This was from the story I told in the opening of this presentation. But more recently, I've also added a dome port to that housing. So I can try some other different things. And this is for shooting shorter focal lengths, so a little bit more wide. And so I thought to myself, well, why not go lay in the beach and shoot back up? And here's a willet here, and there was actually a flock of royal terns there. And so I was trying to shoot towards them like that, and just kind of get a different perspective, like looking from the water back up to the beach instead of the other way. And, things don't always go according to plan, folks. So I'm just hearing some breaking surf right there. But then a little bit later, the surf really found me. I was getting nailed as these terns were flying around. But here's what I was trying to do. I wanted to be there in those crazy waves like that, because this is what I was trying to do. I was letting the waves crash over top of me and the camera housing, so I could actually get like that feeling of being in the crashing surf, looking back up towards the beach, right? Or being in the water, submerged partially as these royal terns fly by. And then I started trying to do things a little bit more interesting with split level shots where I can see partially underwater and some of the birds above the water as well. And you can even see the snowy egret's legs in the water like that. So you need clear water. This wasn't the most clear water, but still having fun effects with this. This was some birds down in Florida where they're very friendly, and I knew I would be able to get relatively close to them and shoot them. This is again with that 10 millimeter lens. So this bird is pretty small in the frame. He was probably about maybe 4 feet away from me, probably even less than that. Just trying to get some interesting, different, and that's the other key for me, is different and creative, beautiful photography. This is one I just did recently around Salt Lake City. I actually went in the mountain stream with this American Dipper and was able to get, same thing, a split level shot with them there. And then the last thing I did with this was in these beautiful clear springs in Florida. The water's like, it's like being in a pool water. It's so incredibly clear, and starting to photograph some of these birds underwater or split level like this, where they're very friendly. I was just a foot or so away from this bird, And then one of my favorite examples of this is being able to capture a bird above and then its prey below, a turtle swimming away like that, this is the kind of stuff I'm after, folks. I love pushing myself. I love pushing my gear and trying to come up with different creative ways to photograph birds and wildlife. So I hope I gave you a lot of ideas to try. I hope you can incorporate some of them, even if you don't have to do the crazy stuff I'm doing. A lot of these ideas are a little bit more simple and just something for you to try to do something different with. If you want to find out more about me and see some of my photography, head on over to rayhennessy.com. Every single day there's a new photo that goes up. I always include my settings and a lot of the times a little bit of a story about that. I have a weekly video podcast that I put out for free on YouTube. You can check that out on my website. I have courses and all kinds of other stuff. I have an audio podcast as well, and tons of other video content that's there for free. So there's tons of stuff for you to check out there, as well as if you'd ever like to join me for a workshop or anything like that. Everything can be found just going to rayhennessy.com. Thank you so much for having me. I really hope you guys had a great time. I certainly did. Any questions? I'm happy to answer them. Let me know. Let's see. What dry suit to shoot on the beach do I recommend? So right now I have one called Dry Fish. It's like DRRYFSH. It's like a weird spelling, I think. It was off of Amazon and it's like 500 bucks, you know, or maybe 550, which for dry suits is relatively cheap. So I've been using that. When I'm in the beach like that with the crashing waves though, I don't use a dry suit at all. I just get wet, you know, like that's, in fact, if I go back, you'll see I'm just like wearing, yeah, I just have like a long sleeve shirt on, a bathing suit. The water is warm enough. I don't know that a dry suit would do so great with like pounding waves and stuff, because when I was in the river for this, where is it? American Dipper shot, that was like rushing water the whole time. And after an hour, I did get a little bit wet inside. Not too bad, but it was more the cold that like completely seized up my legs. I went to stand up after an hour of sitting in this and my muscles almost wouldn't work. That was a little alarming at first because I felt kind of comfortable. I was like, yeah, my legs are getting a little cold. Maybe it's time to end things. And I went to stand up and the muscles were like, nope. And so that was a little bit, you know, sometimes we push a little too far, but I was able to get myself out of there safely and it was fine. Let's see, some other questions. Thanks for all the lovely comments, everybody. Cynthia asks, are you letting the camera auto white balance to try to deal with the color temperature of the water versus the sky? Yeah, I always shoot on auto white balance. For me, it's one less setting to deal with. I can always change it in post just as easily as I could in the camera. So why bother? For me, I'm just gonna dial it in to taste back in post. And so, yeah, I don't really bother setting it out there like manually or even picking a, you know, cloudy, sunny, Kelvin, none of that. But there's nothing wrong with doing that. I know photographers that shoot everything in daylight and then they tweak it later. So it's really up to you. I think that's fine. And so yes, Cynthia says, underwater housings are heavy. Are you using floats for the split screen photos? I have a housing, but can't hold it halfway out of the water for a very long time with the dome on it. Oh, that's interesting, Cynthia. My setup, it is heavy, you're right. But when I put it in the water, all the air in the housing, especially with that big dome port, just keeps it really buoyant. So it's actually far easier to have it partially submerged in the water than it is to hold it out. So I'm surprised to hear you say that. Mine is for the Nikon Z6 III, and then I can put, I have a whole bunch of different lenses that I can put in there that fit in that dome. I think it's like I want to say it's an 8-inch dome port I have for it. So yeah, I'm surprised to hear you say that. To me, I find it actually kind of easier to get into there. So let's see, is this program available to rewatch? I believe so. I think they said they were going to post it, but I guess don't quote me on that. And then the last question I see, John is asking RAW or HE. I don't know what HE is, so if you can clarify that, John, that would be great. But I do shoot RAW format. I don't know if it meant RAW or JPEG, but I do shoot RAW for everything. Yeah, so I think that's all the questions there. So yeah, excellent. If anything else comes up, let me know. Oh, HE is Nikon compressed RAW. Oh yes, so I do shoot the compressed RAW. I just shoot it has the star on it. It's like the star compressed. Oh yeah, high efficiency, that's what that is. So I use the star compression on that. When I first got these cameras, I tested that out. I didn't see a difference. I know technically there's a difference, but I don't see it. And so for me, I'm taking the smaller file size versus, you know, whatever extra color bit depth you get on the uncompressed RAW. It just is not worth it for me. And as you can see, I shoot pretty extreme on my exposures. I adjust the hell out of my photos. I don't notice a difference, but you know, that's just my take. So it's not scientific. It's just what I use. All right. I think we got everything. Oh wait, what after post-processing software do you like to use? Vicky asks. So Vicky, I use Lightroom in combination with Photoshop. So Lightroom is where I do all of my organization. That's what this entire presentation was done in. So I just did that in Lightroom. You can see all my collections over here on the left. This is my creative bird photography thing. But here's the main reason I use Lightroom, right? So look, this presentation, you guys just saw 280 photos. So check this out. I keyword all of my photos with just the species. That's it. It's one simple thing to do. This is what I teach all of my mentorship students to do is if you're using Lightroom and you want to organize your stuff, just add the keyword of just your species, right? Because then I can do something like this, right? I'm just going to type in roseate spoonbill, right? And, well, I guess I got to spell it right, huh? Spoonbill, there we go. Just like that, out of 280 photos, you guys are now looking at the 5 photos that have the keyword spoonbill on it. So I can find a photo just like I want really quick, right? Wedge-tailed tailed shearwater. There's the wedge-tailed shearwater photo, just like that. I can do that on my entire catalog right now, which stands at 114,127 photos. I can find any bird I want in my entire catalog in an instant just by searching for the name of it because I've keyworded every one of them with the species, and it takes a second to do that. It's really, really easy. So I use Lightroom for all of my cataloging and main photo adjustment. And then I also use Photoshop to kind of do like the final edit, you know, so all of these images have gone through Lightroom and Photoshop. That's kind of the combination I use there. So, and I do have courses that teach both of them if you're interested. Okay. All right. Thanks for all the great questions, everybody. Perfect. All right. I think that's all I see. I'll stop sharing and, I guess that's a wrap, Gary.
I think it is. Yeah. Great job. Great presentation. It was really good. Everybody seemed to really enjoy it. So thank you so
Thank
much
you. Thank you.
for coming on and
Yeah,
doing it. Everybody loved it.
sure thing. Sure thing. All right. So do we end this
Yeah.
or
Yeah, I think we end it. So
okay.
I'll just end it. Thanks everyone for joining and I'll talk to you soon, Ray. Thank you so much. All right,
Thanks
bye.
everybody.
Bye.